In 1979 and 1980, 3 young women working in the sex trade in Fall River, Massachusetts were murdered. One person claimed to witness all 3 murders, tying 2 of the murders to a satanic cult and leading to the convictions of 2 men. But what happens when she later recants? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to part 1 of the case that finally nearly defeated me. This week we are going to be going into all of the cases all the way through the court cases, and then part 2 will be a shorter episode on what came next and the question of what really happened here. As usual, I'm only splitting this into 2 parts because I didn't finish in time to have just one really long episode. So I will release part 2 as soon as I can, and hopefully you will not have to wait a week. This is probably the most difficult episode I've ever put together, to the point that I almost shelved it a number of times. The only reason I didn't is that one of the victims never saw any form of justice, and 2, there may be an innocent man still behind bars 40 years later. As that last sentence came out of my mouth, I realized that innocent may be doing some heavy lifting here, so I'll just say innocent of the murder of which he has been convicted. The reason this episode was so hard to put together was not just that the content was very heavy, which it was. There are levels of exploitation here. Plus, I have my own biases as soon as the words satanic cult come up. But really, there are just so many people and stories and moving parts that I could hardly keep it straight. In fact, I am going to absolutely mess things up as I present the case. I mean, I make mistakes all of the time. Sometimes I misspeak and I say the wrong name or the wrong date. And sometimes I just flat out get a fact wrong. Either I processed it wrong, I misunderstood it, I misread it, I found it from an unreliable source and gave it too much weight. There are a number of reasons why my process is not perfect, and neither is my podcast. But the thing with this case is that the facts and the memories and the flat out made up stories are so entangled that there is a near 0% chance that anyone could recount this entire thing and not get something wrong. I read the transcripts to a hearing, and the judge repeatedly got confused and had to ask for clarification, and if the judge can't follow the case, there is really no hope for me. To cite a few sources at the top who are not at fault if I do mess up a detail, I of course used legal documents, some of which I got from the Facebook group Justice for Carl Drew. I will leave it in the show notes. The people who do run that group may wonder why I didn't reach out to them to talk directly for this episode. And the truth is that I needed to go through what I could find on my own independently to form my own opinion, because as those who have listened to my show or talked to me privately about cases probably could already tell you, I am pretty easily swayed back and forth. I've mentioned before that if you put me on a jury of 1, that jury would probably be a hung jury because I go back and forth so much. So when it comes to guilt or innocence advocacy, I generally work on the cases independent of the advocates on either side and then present what I have found and formed my own opinion over. But this episode has been made better, and especially part 2, thanks to their Facebook group, so I definitely wanted to give them a shout out at the top and acknowledge that. Another big source was a 4-part docuseries called Fall River, directed by James Buddy Day, and I highly recommend everyone watch it. It's very well done, it's well paced, they have great interview access, and it even has an investigative element. It is graphic, but not in a way that's not necessary for telling the story. And of course, I use newspapers.com for the archival newspapers that I used. All of my sources are always linked in the show notes. And I also want to give a short disclaimer here that we will be discussing elements of sexual abuse and exploitation, as well as multiple murders. So you can decide if you are in the mental space to hear about all of this, or if you need to listen to this episode later. So with all of those disclaimers and sources acknowledged and all that, we're still not ready to get into the case because we have to talk about something else, and that is the backdrop of this case. In my recent interview with Kate Winkler Dawson, talking about a different case that took place in the same area, Fall River, Massachusetts, we talked about the context of the setting. the mills where young women were working, the religious revivalism, and how all of those things influenced what happened. In these cases, which also take place in Fall River 150 years later, we are taking the mill work and we're replacing it with prostitution. We're taking the religious revivalism and we're replacing it with satanic panic. Now, I promise my entire episode is not going to be a compare and contrast between the two different cases and two different time periods, but just know I'm going to be thinking about it in the back of my mind the entire time. As we know from that episode on Sarah Maria Cornell from a couple weeks ago, Fall River was a growing mill town in her lifetime. And then when we get to the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden, that also happened in Fall River, the town was in an all-out boom, which was relevant to that case because Lizzie's alleged motive had to do with her wealthy father's choices in where to spend his money and where not to. By the time the cases we're talking about today happened, Fall River was in a full-on decline towards urban decay that could be traced back to the mid-1920s as textile manufacturing started to move south, where mills were new and cost of living was low. I think it's interesting we can look at 3 different cases and 3 different time periods and see how the mills of Fall River actually contributed to these cases. Because what happens when a city is in economic decline like this, unemployment goes up, housing becomes harder to come by, and in the 1960s and 70s, they started to see a rise in drugs and prostitution in Fall River. And some have said that the situation was not helped by the police, who were largely looking the other way. This perspective, by the way, is fully acknowledged by a detective in the Fall River docuseries when he pointed out that the hottest strip for prostitution was a block and a half from the police station. Whether it was that the police had a culture of seeing prostitution as a victimless crime, or whether enough cops were taking advantage of the situation by picking up sex workers but letting them go in exchange for sex, or if it was a mix of both, that would be a great deep dive topic for another podcast. Like a lot of the towns with a prostitution issue to the level of Fall River's, there were voluntary sex workers, there were pimps, and there were the exploited. And sometimes we cannot tell from what we know who was who. So while I will use the words sex worker and prostitution most often in this episode, I don't want to imply that everyone I talk about was fully willing in what they were doing. So let me first introduce you to 2 people you need to know about in this case, because they're both at the center of what happened, and they are also 2 of the people who had the most control of the situation. They would identify themselves as pimps or madams, and the first one we're going to talk about is a man named Carl Drew. Carl grew up in New Hampshire in an extremely abusive household. At 14, he was finally big enough to start hitting back, and that's when he decided to run away, and he ended up on the streets in Fall River, Massachusetts. A 14-year-old on the street is a vulnerable person. They are at risk of being exploited, and that, plus his own violent upbringing, may be why Carl grew into being a person with a reputation for violence. Aside from a conviction for holding up a convenience store, it doesn't look like he had that much of a criminal record prior to the early 1980s. At that point, he was in his 20s and he worked in quotes there, as a pimp. He said in the Fall River documentary that he offered women protection for $200 a week, but other people have characterized it as him basically controlling these women through fear, violence, and drugs. He was actually the person they needed protection from. But Carl was not the only person working in a role like this in Fall River, and another one was a young woman named Robin Murphy. Well, Carl was 23 years old when he's doing all these things. Robin was only 17. I have to say, Robin is going to be the most complicated person we discuss in these 2 episodes, and she will challenge where we put the line between victim and perpetrator. Robin was 100% the victim of sexual abuse and assault. When she was about 11 years old, she was hitchhiking through town, which an 11-year-old hitchhiking should tell you a little bit about her upbringing, and she got picked up by a man named Andre Maltese, who went by Andy. It's not entirely clear, but he may have already been grooming her up to that point, but regardless, when he picked her up while she was out hitchhiking, he started sexually abusing her. And this went on for years. Not long after Andy started abusing Robin, one of her older siblings also started sexually abusing her, and Robin's parents, they weren't really around. Her father was living across town with his new wife, and according to what one of Robin's friends said in the Fall River documentary, he had moved on with his new family and made that clear to Robin. Her mother was the provider for 4 children, and she worked a low-paying job, so to make up for a low hourly wage, she just worked a lot of hours, so she was just not really around. By 12 years old, Robin was largely left to her own devices. From what has been reported about Robin's behavior, to me, a non-professional who has never met this woman, she seems to be self-destructive in the way people who have no self-esteem can be. She saw no value in herself, so she didn't really care what happened to her. But on the other hand, she would also go to lengths to get her way in any situation where she thought she did have control. So at 17, the self-destructive side and the controlling behaviors collided, and she was known to physically fight grown men. Robin did have a child at 16, but in the interview she did with the Fall River docuseries, it was very clear to me that she would not answer any question that overlapped into her child's life, and I thought it was very interesting to just see that very protective side of her, because what you're going to see is probably the worst of her in the rest of this episode. On Robin's 17th birthday in October 1979, she moved in with a young woman named Sunny, who had a child about the same age as Robin's child. Sunny was a sex worker, and reportedly she was trying to get Robin into it as well. The question of whether Robin ever engaged in prostitution herself, that is one of those details that just depends on who you ask and when you ask them. She says no, aside from one time. Most of the reporting, though, does say that she did engage in sex work, but we also know she ended up moving out of Sunny's apartment not long after she moved in, saying it was because Sunny was trying to push her into prostitution. Robin preferred to act in the role of the pimp or the madam or whatever you would call a barely 17-year-old who took on that role. Robin Murphy and Carl Drew had different corners in town that they controlled, and they did not get along. They have both said that they hated each other from the start, and a lot of it was probably their competition for business and control. We have 2 strong, controlling personalities, and they're often going to be in conflict whether they're in the boardroom or they're on the street. It really isn't that much different. At some point, Carl and Robin even ended up in a physical altercation when Carl struck Robin in the face, which only made things worse for them. Stuck in the middle of them were a number of women who worked on the streets, and one of these was Doreen Levesque, though I probably shouldn't call her a woman any more than I'm calling Robin a woman. She, too, was only 17. She was actually 11 months older than Robin because she was getting closer to turning 18 at this point. Doreen lived in New Bedford, which is around 20 minutes from Fall River, and she really only went to Fall River to make money, which wasn't really that uncommon. Women around New England would go to Fall River or be trafficked there for the purposes of prostitution because the police were largely looking the other way. But for Doreen, it seems like she preferred Fall River for another reason, and it's because there was less of a chance that someone who knew her would see her. Doreen avoided the corners that were controlled by Carl Drew and Robin Murphy, and she resisted attempts from anybody offering her quote-unquote protection. The only person she sort of worked with was a man named Willie Smith, who let her use his apartment while she was in town. Based on the reporting, it does sound like Doreen may not have had a stable place to live, so there could have been an element of survival sex in what she did. So long as she was working in Fall River, she had a place to stay at Willie's apartment. On the night of Friday, October 12th, 1979, Doreen went to Fall River for the weekend to work. And then the next morning, on Saturday, joggers at a high school in Fall River found a woman's body under the bleachers near the track. When the police arrived, they found a pretty gruesome scene. The woman was face down in a pool of blood. She was bound with fishing wire, and all she was wearing was her shirt, though a jacket and pants were found nearby. What wasn't found at the scene were her underwear, her shoes, and any ID, so the case was initially marked a Jane Doe case. It would take a few days to identify this victim as Doreen Levesque. At the scene, the investigators noticed that the bottoms of her feet were clean while the field was pretty muddy. There was also no indication of a struggle in the mud, so they believed that she had likely been carried to that spot. However, the blood evidence indicated that she was very likely killed there, and the bloody rocks used to beat her to death were still nearby. So it seemed like she had probably been bound while in a vehicle, carried to the spot, and then attacked. On autopsy, it was determined that Doreen had been raped before the blunt force trauma to her head, and one source, the Fall River docuseries, said that she had been raped with an object that was left at the scene. The time of death was put around 2 a.m. Doreen had not been reported missing, so the police released a composite sketch and details about the clothing and the jewelry found with her. It was on Monday, October 15th, that Doreen's mother saw an article in the paper and called the police. Early in the investigation, the police had spoken to a friend of Doreen's who confirmed why Doreen was in Fall River to begin with, which led them to believe she was likely killed by a John. They sent the larger rock that was found at the crime scene to the FBI to check for prints, but otherwise it seemed like they had few leads. And then, less than 4 weeks later, 19-year-old Barbara Raposa went missing. Barbara's age has been reported as anywhere from 17 to 22. So, for the second time in about a month, I had to dust off my genealogical research hat, and I learned she was a month shy of her 20th birthday when she disappeared. Barbara lived in Fall River, and like most of the women we're discussing today, she was known to be a sex worker. It's not clear whether she worked for anyone like Carl Drew or Robin Murphy, but we do know she had a connection to Robin through Andy Maltese. Andy was the man who had been abusing Robin for years. At some point, I'm assuming when Barbara was probably still a minor, she also met Andy. Their relationship is most often characterized as a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, which is how Barbara saw it. But he was 43 years old when she was 19, and because of those reports that they had lived together for a few years, I think it's very possible they were together before she turned 18, which makes it hard for me to see any romance in this scenario. You all know that I use newspapers.com all the time in making my episodes, but before I was a podcaster, I was someone who always wanted to know the rest of the story. And as true crime fans, I know you know that there is always more to the story. Now is the perfect time to dig deeper into cases and mysteries that fascinate you, and there's no better place to do it than with newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive. Whether we are talking about the big name cases or those small hometown stories that fascinated you when you were younger, and then you do a web search for them and get 0 hits, you are going to have access to those stories that you won't find anywhere else, from the front page headlines to forgotten cases. And be aware that after you go to newspapers.com and you search for what you're looking for, you read the articles, and then you're going to scan the articles around it. And then you'll find your next deep dive topic. Ask me how I know. Your subscription to newspapers.com is going to unlock over 1 billion newspaper pages from the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and beyond, going back as far as 1690 or as recent as a month ago. You're going to get all of the details that never made it into the history books. For listeners of Crimelines, newspapers.com is offering a special discount of 20% off. Just use the code Crimelines at checkout. The clues to history's mysteries are waiting for you on newspapers.com. Barbara did have an infant son at the time she disappeared, and the reporting from the time refers to Andy as his father, but by November of 1979, they had either broken up or were in the process of it. On Wednesday, November 7th, 1979, Barbara had plans to go out with a different man named David, so the two dropped her son off at the babysitter so they could go out for the night. According to court documents, David said that while they were out, Barbara wanted to pick up a few johns to make some money. So he dropped her off at around 8:15 in the evening, and they made plans to meet up in a few hours at a nearby bar. But Barbara never showed up. He left a couple of times to look around for her on the street, but he never found her, so he left around 1 in the morning. The next day, when Barbara didn't pick her son up from the babysitter's house, she was reported missing. Some sources say Andy reported her missing, but the court documents say that it was her father who did. But we do know that Andy went to the police repeatedly during the investigation. On November 12th, 5 days after Barbara was last seen, he went for the first time to the Fall River Police Station to ask them for information regarding Barbara's case. He went at least 2 more times in the next 2 weeks, with the officer telling him each time that they really had no updates for him. And then Andy would tell them whatever recent rumor he had heard around town about what had happened to Barbara. But it wasn't just Barbara's case that Andy was trying to be helpful with. Around the same time he was checking on the progress in her case, he also went to one of his friends' houses. Now, the word friend may be stretching it a bit. This was a guy he knew from school, and this guy had become a state trooper. So Andy went to him and told him that he knew 2 women who knew something about Doreen Levesque's murder. Andy then arranged a meeting with a corporal at the state barracks, and he showed up with Robin Murphy and her girlfriend, 20-year-old Karen Marsden. So Karen Marsden is another woman in this group of people. She, like the others, had a rough upbringing, and she was on her own rather young. Because she was hanging out on the streets with other teens in similar situations, she also got into drugs and prostitution. In the summer of 1979, Karen had a son who was living with a foster family, and she was working for Carl Drew on the streets while she was also living with him in some type of relationship. Shortly after Doreen Levesque's murder, Karen stopped working for Carl and moved in with a friend of hers named Carol Fletcher. And then, when Robin moved out of Sunny's house, she moved in with Karen at Carol's place. So Karen was ending whatever relationship she had with Carl Drew right around the time she was starting a new relationship with Robin. According to the people who were in this group and those who knew them, including those interviewed in the Fall River docuseries, it seems like Karen stood out from the group because she was not hardened the way most of them were. These hard shells that everyone else managed to develop to survive this life they had lived, some of them since they were children, Karen just really didn't have one. So she really struggled emotionally and mentally with everything going on in her life, and she had even gone to a psychiatric hospital at least once to try to get some help. She wanted out of the life she was living, but without a support system or resources, and with addiction and mental health issues, there just didn't seem to be a path forward. And it was because of these factors that pretty much every investigator on the cases we're talking about quickly identified Karen Marsden as the weak link in the group. She was the one who would give in and talk, if she had enough pressure. At this first meeting with the state trooper in December of 1979, the meeting Andy had arranged with Corporal Fitzgerald, Karen being the weak link was pretty obvious in how she versus Robin answered questions. Robin stayed calm and cool and had very little to say, while Karen reportedly told Corporal Fitzgerald that she knew who killed Doreen Levesque, and it was Carl Drew. He pushed her for more information, more details, but she wouldn't say anything else. He didn't even know how she knew Carl Drew killed Doreen. Did he confess to her? Did she hear it on the street? Did she witness it? She wouldn't say. But what she did say was more than anyone else was saying, so he took note of it and continued his investigation. Andy then kept in sporadic contact with Corporal Fitzgerald for a few more weeks, leading up to when Barbara Raposa's body was found. It was Sunday, January 27th, 1980, and a man walking his dog through the woods behind the old print shop in town saw the body and called the police. At the scene, they found the frozen body of a young woman who was bound at the hands and feet, just like Doreen Levesque. Also like Doreen, she had been bashed in the head, likely by some pieces of cement blocks that were nearby. She had no identification on her, but because Barbara Raposa had been reported missing, her description was quickly matched to that report, and then they were able to confirm the identification through a dental comparison. The next day, 2 Fall River detectives went to Andy Maltese's apartment a little after 5 in the morning. He lived there with his mother, and she was the one who answered the door because Andy was still asleep. When he was awake and came out of the bedroom, they told him that they had found a body and wanted to talk to him at the station. And according to the court documents, he asked if it was about Barbara, and they said yes. He drove himself to the station, and the interview began around 5:15. Over the course of that day, Andy was basically interviewed 3 times. The first 2 times were while he was at the station that morning, and before each interview, he had his rights read to him. He wasn't under arrest or being detained, but they certainly viewed him as a potential suspect. He left the station mid-morning, but then came back around noon for a 3rd interview, at which time, again, his rights were read to him. Andy's story was basically that he hadn't seen Barbara since the day before she disappeared, November 6th. He had gone over to her apartment in the afternoon, and while she took a nap, he took care of the baby and did some dishes for her. As for where he was on November 7th, the night Barbara disappeared and was likely murdered, he was at home with his mother. After making this statement, Andy consented to searches of his car and his mother's apartment, and he seemed very cooperative. Andy spoke with the police 2 days later when Corporal Fitzgerald called him and asked if he would talk to them again, but this time with the district attorney present. He agreed and basically told the same story he told the first time. He did say that he believed that if they took him to where they had found Barbara's body, he might be able to help them investigate. They told him that they'd call him the next time they were going out there, and it's pretty clear that they were just going to keep accepting Andy's help as long as it kept him talking. On February 5th, Andy called Corporal Fitzgerald and told him that he had a dream that he wanted to talk about. They met at the DA's office again, and Andy was again read his rights. They read him his rights every single time they talked to him, and every time they took a break and started talking to him again, they read them again. It was to the point that Andy literally said, quote, "You've told me this 100 times, you don't have to tell me again," end quote. But they did it anyway, and this was pretty common in those first couple decades after the Miranda warning ruling in 1966. This has been refined through the courts on exactly when the Miranda warning must be read and what conditions trigger it. But before we had all of this case law enforcement agencies were overly cautious, so they would read the warning again and again and again. So let's go ahead and get to Andy's dream. He said that he saw 2 angels in this dream who showed him Barbara's murder as it happened. He was positioned floating in the air above her, about in line with the tops of the trees. He said he saw a man carry Barbara and drop her on the ground. This man walked away a bit and picked up an object. He came back to Barbara and struck her repeatedly in the face with whatever was in his hand. When Andy was asked what was in his hand, the DA actually suggested two things to him. Was it a knife or a gun? But Andy said no. It looked like a rock. Now, the murder weapon had not been made public at that time. Andy said the man was screaming and cursing in what Andy characterized as bad English. He even made a comment about the man being Portuguese. And Barbara was yelling, "Andy, help me. Andy, forgive me." And the man told her, "Andy is not going to help you." Andy then gave some motives as to why the man killed Barbara. Maybe it was unrequited love. Maybe it was a love triangle. Maybe it was someone who hated prostitution. The district attorney pulled out a photograph of the crime scene for Andy to look at. This was a picture that ran in the local paper, so it was not a crime scene photo that had the body in it. It was just really a picture of the woods. He asked Andy to mark two spots. One, where was he positioned in this dream? And two, where did the murder take place? And where he indicated was the basic area where Barbara had been killed. So then they took Andy out to the site where they had found Barbara's body, which was the woods behind the old printer's building. An officer taking Andy out to the site heard him say, quote, "I think they've got me now." And then when they got to the site, he got out of the car saying, quote, "I know they've got me now." As they walked through the woods, Andy said he was getting, quote, "vibes and visions," and then they spent about the next 3 hours with Andy detailing how the crime occurred. It started with him stopping by a tree and saying that's where Barbara's body was, and he even indicated the position she was in with her feet at the base of the tree. According to the police, this is exactly where she was found. Andy didn't stop there. He kept going on to say that the murderer probably planned on having sex with Barbara and that she knew her killer but was surprised that he attacked her. According to court records, he then showed how the killer stood and said the man grabbed a rock about 12 inches across and struck her in the face first and then other areas of her head. Andy even directed one of the officers to park his car right where he said the killer's car had been parked, and then had him open the trunk because he said maybe the man had taken Barbara out of the trunk. He said Barbara's hands had been tied and indicated to a mound of broken concrete and said he sensed the murder weapon had come from that pile. Basically, Andy described the murder with details he should not have known had he not been there. After the 3 hours at the scene, Andy was free to go, and then 2 days later, after the DA and the investigators looked at what they had, Andy Maltese was arrested on February 7th, 1980, and charged with Barbara's murder. While all of that was happening, the police were still investigating Doreen's murder. In spite of the similarities between her death and Barbara's, as they started narrowing in on Andy, they were investigating these cases as completely separate. They believed Andy had killed Barbara because their relationship was ending. He wouldn't have that same motive with Doreen Levesque. So they kept on leaning on Karen Marsden, who seemed to know more than she was saying. On February 8th, 1980, the day after Andy was arrested, Karen spoke with the detectives again, and she took them out to the Freetown State Forest, where she said Carl Drew would bring people for his satanic rituals. Karen was described by one of the detectives in that Fall River docuseries as incoherent at the time they went out there. All they could get out of her was that she was afraid, and she was worried that her son was also in danger. They offered her protective custody, but she said she didn't want it. She wanted to be dropped off at a church where they saw her go inside to speak with the priest. The issue with Karen's statements to the police is, although she met with them several times, she never gave them enough information to do anything with. She never said, "This is who killed Doreen, and this is what I know, and this is how I know it." Aside from one state trooper, I don't know that she specifically named Carl Drew to any of the other investigators, except in relation to the supposed satanic cult. We also know the same night that Karen went to visit her son at his foster home, and Robin Murphy was with her. They left the foster family's house around 8:30, and at some point they separated because Robin showed up at Sunny's apartment around 9:50 and she was alone. Sunny remembered the time because Robin was supposed to be there for dinner at 7 and just never showed up. And she was annoyed. So yeah, she definitely looked at the clock when Robin finally got there to see how late she was. Sunny would later say that Robin was sweaty when she arrived, but there wasn't much of an explanation for why. She was upset, and she told Sunny that Andy had been arrested for Barbara's murder, and she knew something about it. So Sunny and Robin decided to go to the police, who first came out to Sunny's apartment that night after midnight, so we're going into February 9th. But Robin was intoxicated and she was in no condition to give a real statement, so they waited a few hours, and down at the station, she decided to tell what she knew. Robin told the police that before Barbara's body was found, she was talking to Andy about Barbara's disappearance, and he said that Barbara was lying dead in the woods. Robin said, she probably was just running away from him, and he said that wasn't true. She was in the woods, and he knew that because angels had carried him over the scene. He basically recounted his dream to her, but the main difference was that he told Robin about his dream before Barbara's body was found, not after, like with the police. Now, this was interesting and maybe useful in a larger case against him, but it was hardly a bombshell. According to what Robin said, many years later, in 2012, she realized that the information she was giving was not enough, so she asked them if she was in the car with Barbara and Andy when the murder happened, would that be enough to quote-unquote pick him up? So she was basically saying in 2012 that the police knew she was not about to be entirely honest with the rest of what she said, but they went along with it anyway. My only issue with this is that by the time this happened, they had already arrested Andy, so she didn't need to give them more to get him arrested, like she said. But she did tell this particular version of the story in 2012, which was 30 years down the road, so maybe she had a fuzzy memory in the order things happened, and that's to be expected. Maybe her actual thinking was that she wanted to make sure he was convicted. Or maybe she really was there and her 2012 denial was the lie. Before we can evaluate any of that, let's get into the story of what she may have witnessed. According to Robin's story, she was out on November 7th, and at some point between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., she called Andy to ask him for a ride to her mom's house. He said he would go ahead and pick her up because he was already heading to the area to pick up Barbara, who had called him first. So he picked up Robin, and then on the short drive to where Barbara was, Andy vented to Robin about Barbara's new relationship with this guy named David, and he said he was going to kill her. When they got to the diner where Barbara was waiting, Robin got into the back seat so Barbara could get into the front. Andy passed around a joint, and they drove and smoked until Barbara started asking Robin what was she doing in Andy's car. This led to a verbal argument that then turned physical when Barbara turned around in her seat and punched Robin. Before long, both women were in the back seat, physically fighting, and Andy just kept driving. Eventually, he stopped in the wooded area behind the print shop, and Andy got out of the front seat and opened the back door, pulling Barbara off of Robin. Robin stayed in the car while Andy and Barbara talked for a bit, and after Barbara seemed to have calmed down, Andy went back to the driver's side and took out the keys so he could open the trunk. He pulled out 2 paper bags that Robin knew he kept sex toys in, and then he and Barbara went off into the woods. Robin looked over to where they went and realized they were having sex, so she turned back around and waited. She said she heard Barbara scream at some point and looked out to see what was going on. She said that she saw Andy sitting or straddling Barbara and he was holding a rock in his hands, raised high above his head. Robin turned back around and just sat there and waited. Eventually, Andy came back to the car saying something about how Barbara could crawl home. He then drove Robin to her mom's house as promised. Hours later, Robin said she got a call from Andy, and Andy asked her, quote, "What happened to Barbara?" Robin told him she didn't know, which was a response that she had almost been trained to give. Over the years that Andy had been abusing Robin, she had seen him hurt other women and girls. And when she would witness it, he would do the same thing. He would later ask her what happened to them and made sure the answer was, "I don't know." After Robin gave her statement, the investigators brought her out to the scene like they had done with Andy, and she accurately pointed out where the murder took place. Robin's statement was putting her at the scene as a witness to the murder, and that was going to go a long way to proving that Andy did this at trial. But before they could even get there, the Fall River police found themselves investigating a third murder case. The day after Robin showed up at Sonny's house all sweaty, the day she was giving this statement to the police, Karen Marsden was reported missing. After Karen had visited her son at his foster home, she vanished without a trace. It was known that Karen had been talking about moving away, leaving the state to start over somewhere else and get her head on straight, but it doesn't seem like the investigators thought that's just what happened. They also didn't seem to make another assumption that we've seen before. They didn't assume she was just off on a bender somewhere and would make contact in a few days. They actually started looking for her immediately because the truth was, as chaotic as Karen's life could be at times, she was always in daily contact with her loved ones. So on February 10th, the investigators interviewed Carol Fletcher, who was the friend that Karen mostly lived with when she wasn't staying with her grandmother. She said that she had seen Karen on February 8th when she was last seen alive at around 8:30. So this wouldn't have been long after she had visited with her son. According to Carol, they were talking in her car when a green Plymouth Duster pulled up alongside them. Karen made a quick deal with the guy, sex in exchange for $35, and she got out of Carol's car and into the man's car. That was the last Carol had seen of her. So here's another spot the investigators could have made an assumption. They could have assumed that she had gotten in the car with a John and things went badly from there. But the investigators knew from the 4, 5, 6 times or more that they talked to Karen in regards to Doreen's murder, that she wasn't afraid of some random guy out there. She was actually afraid of specific people in town thinking that they were going to do her harm. And as the investigators kept speaking with more and more people, they kept hearing the same 2 names again and again. Karen was afraid of Carl Drew, and to a lesser extent, Robin Murphy. The truth was that most people in their circle were at least a little afraid of both of them. Some because they had been directly threatened, and others because they just knew these two were people capable of violence. But more people had heard Karen express true fear of Carl Drew, with her son's father telling the police that Karen told him that she saw Carl kill Doreen Levesque. In trying to solve both Doreen's murder and Karen's disappearance, which the investigators believed were connected, the detectives were spending a lot of time at Sonny's apartment, a move that would get some criticism later. They were not there undercover. They were there as cops with these young women, some of them underage, and they had permission to do what it took to get them to talk. That included buying them beer and even marijuana. In the 1980s, the marijuana part got some pearls clutched, but I want to remind everyone that Robin here was 17. You can't tell me there weren't other minors around as well. And the investigators knew that some of the women, whether they were minors or not, were being sexually exploited. However, their singular focus was to solve the murders. I'm a big fan of seeing crimes getting solved, so I get it. But to solve those crimes, they were watching other crimes, not victimless crimes, being committed. And even if the homicide investigators were not in a position to solve the problem of sexual exploitation, maybe they could have found someone who could have done something. But they didn't, and they would get some backlash for that. So we have these investigators hanging out at Sonny's apartment, and they wouldn't get any big breaks through this process until after Karen Marsden's skull was found. On April 13th, 1980, the upper section of a human skull was found in the woods in Westport, Massachusetts. That is not that far from Fall River. They suspected that these were the remains of Karen Marsden, but they didn't have the lower jaw, so the dental comparison would be somewhat limited. But in this case, they got a pretty big break because they had an X-ray they could use. Karen had been dealing with chronic sinus issues, so just about 6 months before she disappeared, the doctor did an X-ray of her skull. X-rays are used to diagnose sinus conditions because your sinuses should be full of air, so if anything shows up on the X-ray, they can sometimes identify the cause of the issue. And in Karen's case, she had a malformation. Using that, they were able to compare and conclude that this was Karen Marsden's skull. They also used hair that was found nearby on rocks to compare with hairs from Karen's hairbrush, and a search of the area did turn up some clothes that were consistent with what Karen wore. The only thing they couldn't find was the rest of her body. At the time Karen's skull was found, Robin Murphy was in protective custody because she was a witness in Barbara's case, and Andy had managed to bail out of jail. The police didn't offer her this protection. She actually went past them and asked for it straight from the district attorney. Initially, she was in this type of protective custody in Fall River, and she would kind of come and go as she pleased, which makes me wonder what the protective part was, but eventually she moved to the Dallas, Texas area to stay with a friend. The investigators in Fall River, after Karen's skull was found, really wanted to talk to Robin because of something Sonny had told them. Sonny said that Robin admitted to her that she was involved in Karen's murder. So on April 23rd, the investigators were at Sonny's apartment when Robin called to talk to her. They ended up listening in while Sonny complained to Robin that the police were driving her crazy and how she wished Robin had never told her anything about what happened. The hope here was to get Robin to confess to something, but it doesn't seem like she gave out too many details on this call, but what she said seemed to confirm that she had some knowledge of what happened to Karen and may have been involved in it. This was enough for them to take Robin into custody and bring her back to Massachusetts. And it wasn't long before she started talking, not just about Karen's murder, but also Doreen's. And her stories all centered around the same person, Carl Drew. I have to say that this is a hard story to tell, not just because the details are graphic, though that is part of it, but because Robin changed the story a number of times in the retelling, so the details are rarely reported on the same way twice. Even things that are the same in the various stories she told would be given in a different order. So the best we can do is blend what she said over the period of months and put it into a somewhat cohesive narrative. We'll kind of call this the final version of the story. According to Robin, Carl Drew was the head of a small satanic cult that included Karen Marsden. They would go out in the woods and do seances and chants and speak in demonic tongues and try to summon Satan and I guess all the things you would expect them to do. Someone who was not part of this group was Doreen Levesque. She came to Fall River to work, but she otherwise tried to just go home to New Bedford and not really get involved in the scene. Robin said Carl was not happy about her refusal to join him, so one night while she, Carl, and Willie Smith were in the car, Carl picked up Doreen by inviting her to go smoke pot with them. And in case you forgot, Willie Smith is the guy whose apartment Doreen would use. Robin said that as they drove around, Carl started telling Doreen that she couldn't work on the street alone and she needed his protection. She turned him down, an argument ensued, and he ended up slapping her. Then he drove them all out to the high school where he and Willie pulled Doreen from the car. Robin stayed in the car and she said she didn't even know if Doreen was killed that night or just attacked, until it hit the news the next day after her body was found under the bleachers. It seems some versions of this story also include Karen Marsden being present, and a later version of the story would include Carl doing some satanic chanting during the attack. At some point after the murder, Carl told Karen that Doreen was killed for not listening to him and that the same thing would happen to her. That's why Karen was so scared of Carl, and she left him not long after this. She started a new relationship with Robin and then started making plans to just leave the state entirely. This made Carl very nervous that Karen was going to inform on him to the police. You know, those officers who were always hanging around Sonny's apartment. He felt he was losing control of her. Fear had stopped her from talking thus far, but if she got out of the state and felt safe enough, she might go to the police about Doreen's murder. According to Robin, that was Carl's motive for then killing Karen. And yes, Robin was there for this one as well, but she didn't stay in the car this time. On the night Karen was murdered, Robin ended up in the car with a bunch of people, which included Karen. Carol Fletcher was driving, and Carl Drew and another guy named Carl Davis also got into the car at some point. We're going to call Carl Davis just by his last name because this case is confusing enough without there being two Carls. According to Robin's story, or whatever version of the story you want to believe, they all drove out to the woods in Westport at Carl's direction. When Carol stopped the car, Carl told Robin to get Karen out of the car. Robin dragged Karen out, and they started pulling her towards the trees as they were hitting her. The attack continued with a quote-unquote stoning, which may have also been done in Doreen's case, depending on the stories you want to believe, and then one of Karen's fingers was cut off. After that, Davis handed Robin a knife, and Carl told her to slit Karen's throat, which she did. Then Carl and Davis tore Karen's head from her body and kicked it into the woods. But in a different version, they actually took the head with them in the trunk, and Carl threw it into the woods in a different location away from the body. Other things were done within this time to defile the body, including Robin being ordered to perform a sex act on it, and Carl carving an X in Karen's torso before speaking in a demonic language. He then used some of Karen's blood to mark a cross or an X on Robin's forehead. To conceal what they did, one of them poured gasoline on Karen's body, and they burned it to ashes, which explained why they never found more than that upper skull. Carl assured all of them that because they killed Karen for Satan, they would be protected from any legal trouble. Now, there were some signs before they took any version of this story to a jury that maybe, just maybe, the story was BS. For one thing, Robin couldn't keep it straight. Like I said, I put the stories into a single narrative, but that is not how she told it. She gave out information in a piecemeal fashion, and all of the satanic ritual elements, none of those came out in her first stories. Those were after investigators started asking specifically about it, and then she started adding elements of the satanic cult into the next version. Also, it seems very convenient that the only body with evidence of ritual mutilation, the carving of the X, was the case where they never found a body. There was nothing like that on Doreen's body at all, and the pathologist came out and said that straight out. The other major issue is the thing I try to focus on with so many cases, and that is the timeline. We know that Karen was visiting her son with Robin until as late as 8:30 that night. And Robin was back in Fall River at Sonny's apartment at 9:50. So this is the window where the murder would have happened. Now let's say the foster family is wrong and Karen left at more like 8 o'clock. And then Sonny's clock, it was running slow that night, so Robin actually got there at 10. The absolute most generous window we have is 2 hours. So could all of the things Robin said happen actually take place within 2 hours? The first thing we have to account for is drive time. From the foster home to Fall River, where Carol Fletcher picked all these people up in her car, was a 20-minute drive. And then it was a 30-minute drive out to where Karen was killed, and then a 30-minute drive back to Fall River for Robin to be dropped off at Sonny's apartment. So of our 2 hours, an hour and 20 minutes of this is just spent driving. And that is if no one waited at all. Everyone just beamed into the cars instantaneously. And honestly, this is why I bloated the timeline, because if we stick strictly to the witness accounts of Karen leaving one place at about 8:30 and Robin showing up at another place at 9:50, we use up all the time just driving, so no murder could have taken place. We have to drag out the timeline for the murder to even have happened the way Robin said. But even then, even if we add 40 minutes to it, there still isn't enough time for one element of the crime, and that is that Robin said they burned the body to ash. Even in a crematorium, this is a process that takes hours. So we know at least that part had to have been made up. Again, this is a detail that was not in Robin's first statement. It was a later addition. But at some point, as your witness is adding and changing details, you have to ask yourself if the reason they can't keep the story straight is because it was a lie. Another detail that wasn't in the original story was that Carol Fletcher was there at all, and that she was the driver. She didn't show up in Robin's version of events until after the police spoke to her. At the point Karen's skull was found, Carol had left the state and was living with family elsewhere. The investigators went out to where she was living to speak with her in person on May 1st, 1980, which is about 2.5 weeks after the skull was found. While Karen was missing, Carol had said that she saw her get into a green duster, and according to Robin's story, that would not have happened, so they wanted to clear this up. But when they got out there, Carol was in no position to be interviewed. She was sobbing, she was self-soothing by chewing on her hair, and she even vomited during the interview. So this was largely a bust. However, she would eventually speak to the police, and what she said would largely back up Robin's story. Or at least the version of the story that involves Carol being there. The summary of Carol's interview with the police that I have is from the Carl Drew Facebook page that I mentioned earlier. And the interview happened in November of 1980, which was 7 months after Robin's statement. So unfortunately, I don't feel like we can take this as a fully independent witness statement, as this was plenty of time for Carol to learn what Robin had said and then regurgitate some form of it. But it is what we have, and it is close enough to her eventual trial testimony. Carol said that on February 8th, 1980, she was hanging out with the other Carl Davis, and they went out to a bar in the late afternoon. Karen was there and told Carol that she was scared for her own safety. She said she was moving to Florida to get away from everything and that she had just told Robin that she was leaving. Karen was afraid of too many people in Fall River to stay, and that included Carl Drew, Carl Davis, and of course, Robin Murphy. Later that night, Carol said she was driving around when she saw Robin and Karen together. They got into her car, and then later, the two Carls got in. Carol said as they drove out to the woods, Karen was crying, but the other three, including Robin, all seemed perfectly calm. At some point, Robin told Karen that she shouldn't have made plans to leave. Another detail that Carol added is that after they got to the woods and Karen was being dragged from her car, Karen yelled out to, quote, make sure nothing happens to Jay, Jay being her son. And then Carol said Robin Murphy, Carl Drew, and Carl Davis killed Karen. After the murder, Carol drove everyone back to Fall River, and Carl Drew and Robin got out near Sonny's apartment. She and Davis went back to her apartment and then left to go see some people in another city. You all know that I use newspapers.com all the time in making my episodes, but before I was a podcaster, I was someone who always wanted to know the rest of the story. And as true crime fans, I know you know that there is always more to the story. Now is the perfect time to dig deeper into cases and mysteries that fascinate you, and there's no better place to do it than with newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive. Whether we are talking about the big name cases or those small hometown stories that fascinated you when you were younger, and then you do a web search for them and get 0 hits, you are going to have access to those stories that you won't find anywhere else, from the front page headlines to forgotten cases. And be aware that after you go to newspapers.com and you search for what you're looking for, you read the articles, and then you're going to scan the articles around it. And then you'll find your next deep dive topic. Ask me how I know. Your subscription to newspapers.com is going to unlock over 1 billion newspaper pages from the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and beyond, going back as far as 1690 or as recent as a month ago. You're going to get all of the details that never made it into the history books. For listeners of Crimelines, newspapers.com is offering a special discount of 20% off. Just use the code Crimelines at checkout. The clues to history's mysteries are waiting for you on newspapers.com. The police hoped to get some forensic evidence to back up Robin and Carol's stories. Carol was driving a rental car the night all of this happened, so the investigators searched it, hoping they'd find something, but they didn't. Now, we have seen cases where a known killer has gotten lucky and managed not to transfer any blood to their vehicle, but in this case, we have 3 people interacting with Karen's body in some way. And with all of the things they supposedly did, it would be pretty lucky that none of them transferred blood to the car. Of course, that said, this was a rental car, so it may have been cleaned to some extent since Carol had it. Maybe there was a small amount of blood, but it got wiped up already. Even without forensic evidence, though, the state moved ahead with the charges against 25-year-old Carl Drew, 24-year-old Carl Davis, and 17-year-old Robin Murphy, and charged all 3 with the murder of Karen Marsden. Carol Fletcher was given immunity in exchange for her testimony. Shortly before these arrests, it started hitting the media that the killings were part of a satanic cult. The police said there was no solid evidence of that, but they did have several women who told them about devil-worshipping rituals within this group. The medical examiner said there were no signs of that in what he saw on the autopsies, and while he did acknowledge the violence of the murders was extreme, nothing appeared to be ritualistic. The first article I saw at newspapers.com referring to the satanic cult was in the Boston Globe on April 19th, 1980, and really once something is in a big paper like this, it's going to spread pretty quickly. And this is just another spot I'm going to recommend the docuseries Fall River because they get into satanic panic more than I'm going to here. And they actually talked about some things I didn't know about. And I grew up during the time of satanic panic, and I had a parent who fully bought into it. I was talking to a friend about it recently, and I called it the pedestrian version because most of us were not getting murdered in the 1980s or getting coached about how our daycare providers were assaulting us. But we would be told that if we listened to Ozzy Osbourne or we played Dungeons and Dragons, we were welcoming demons into our lives and we could get possessed. It wasn't, in my case, exactly traumatizing like I've heard from others because it didn't really come up on a daily basis. But I have talked to other people who were subjected to this type of talk regularly, and they were subjected to these very scary ideas and images of Satan and demons. And it did have a serious impact, particularly since they were children being fed a horror story pretty regularly. And it really strikes me that the same parents who wouldn't let their kids listen to heavy metal because of subliminal satanic messaging would then talk to their 6-year-old about demonic possession. To me, it's a weird disconnect, but as usual, that's another story for another podcast. All that to say, I know satanic panic from a lived experience of being a child during it, but the Fall River docuseries really talks about the origins and how the Cold War actually helped fuel it. It was the in God we trust people versus the anti-theists. And it was interesting and worth a watch, but I feel like most true crime listeners today are aware enough of satanic panic in the context of these types of cases that I don't have to get into a ton of detail here. You've probably heard it before, probably in regards to maybe the West Memphis 3. So focusing on this case specifically and not the broader idea of satanic panic, I will say the investigators did find evidence that the group was dabbling in some sort of Satanism, but from what they have said, I get the impression this is more of what we would call being edgy these days. They would randomly chant things and they would hang up an inverted pentagram, but nothing more than that was ever witnessed. They had informants telling them about how the group would do ceremonies and ritualistic killings of animals and maybe even people at the campsite fireplaces in the Freetown State Forest. But none of these people ever reported seeing it themselves. They were reporting what they heard had happened from other group members. But putting Satanism aside, they did still have 3 women who had been killed. And Robin said that 2 of those murders were part of a satanic ritual, so maybe there was a little something to it. Or maybe Carl Drew just added those things in to scare everyone else into not talking to the police. Maybe he was the origin of all of the stories about the actions of his cult so that he could scare and control these women, which is what he tried to do with Karen Marsden. And when he couldn't control her, according to Robin, he forced Robin, through her own fear, to participate in killing Karen. If his goal was to stop Robin and Carol from speaking, it didn't work because both of them eventually talked. And Robin's talking landed her with her own charges. They gave her immunity in both Doreen and Barbara's cases in exchange for her testimony because all she admitted to doing was sitting in the car. But with Karen's case, she said she was the one who slit her throat and defiled her body. There was no way she was going to get away with this scot-free, so instead, she made a deal. In exchange for her testimony, she could plead guilty to second-degree murder and be sentenced to 15 years to life. Her attorney told her she would likely be paroled after 12. So Robin pleaded guilty in January of 1981, just before the start of the trial of Andy Maltese for the murder of Barbara Raposa. Robin was the key witness against him, but he was also a key witness against himself if you count all of those statements about the dream/vision he had. All of those statements were admissible thanks to them reading him his Miranda warning again and again and again. After an 11-day trial, the jury deliberated for nearly 5 hours before they found Andy guilty, and he was given a life sentence. And it was just 2 months later that Carl Drew went on trial for the murder of Karen Marsden. Shortly before his trial, he and Willie Smith were also indicted for Doreen Levesque's murder, and there was some debate over whether Doreen's murder could be mentioned at the trial about Karen's murder. Carl was indicted, but he had not been convicted in that case. But according to Robin, the motive for killing Karen was because she was going to inform on him to the police about Doreen's murder, so the judge let it in. The crimes under this theory were connected. Obviously, Robin and Carol were witnesses, but there was more that the state had than just them. They had a woman named Mildred who worked for Carl, who said she heard Carl threaten to kill Karen just 2 months before the murder. Mildred said that it was early December 1979, so after Doreen's murder and right around the time Karen was leaving him. Mildred said she saw Carl pull a knife out and put it to Karen's throat. She told him, "Do me a favor, kill me now, and don't make me wait." He didn't, or at least not that night. After this incident, according to witnesses, Karen was trying to avoid Carl even though he was looking for her, asking around to see if anyone saw her. According to Carol's testimony, days before the murder, Carl said that in the right time and the right place, he was going to kill Karen. The state also called a woman named Aaliyah to the stand. She was dating Carl at the time of Karen's murder, and she said that one night in February of 1980, the day of or after Karen disappeared, she saw Carl in a bar. He was holding a ring, and she said, "Oh, is that for me?" and then put the ring on. Later, when she learned about what happened to Karen, she took the ring to the state police, who then showed it to Karen's family, and her mother identified it as one of Karen's rings. Robin claimed that Carl took it from Karen when he cut off her finger. Leah also testified that one night Carl talked about how he killed a girl because she was trying to leave his cult and that he wanted her to feel pain. This wasn't the state's entire case, but I do feel like these are the important points to remember for part 2. Let's get to Carl's defense, and his defense was lacking, let's be honest. Even one of the investigators who participated in the Fall River docuseries, who still believes Carl Drew is guilty to this day, admitted that the defense was insufficient. Carl was, at the time, functionally illiterate. He could hardly read, and he could only write well enough to sign his name. So he was more dependent on his attorney than the average 26-year-old would be. But his attorney simply did not know how to defend someone accused of murder. And that's because he had never done it before. This was not just his first murder trial, but a lot of reports say that this was his first criminal defense. And he never took another murder case after this. There are a bunch of things that we can point to as far as his attorney dropping the ball, like the lack of a real solid cross-examination of Carol Fletcher. But let's focus on the most important issue in my view. Carl was presenting an alibi defense. Not only was he saying he did not do it, he was saying he could not have done it because he was with other people all night. So if his attorney did anything right, it should have been to get that alibi locked in. One source of the alibi was a woman the police spoke to back in May of 1980. She said that on the night Karen Marsden disappeared, she had been with Carl because she was working for him. She was picking up Johns between 2 different bars in Fall River, and Carl was in those bars keeping an eye on her. That's part of the quote-unquote protection he offered, though it also made it easier for him to control her and make sure she was giving him money. Anyway, she said she would leave with clients for anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes, and then she would be right back. And every time she came back, Carl was there all night long. On cross-examination, the state asked her how she knew it was February 8th that this happened. And she said it was because it was a Friday night and she was with him every Friday night. So they pointed out that that meant she couldn't really tell one Friday from another, and maybe she was thinking of a different week. Nothing stood out to her to let her know that, yes, it was this Friday that they were in those two bars. The defense could have really shored up this alibi by talking to people who were there that night. It's not like Carl was sitting by himself just waiting. He was there with friends, so the defense sent an investigator out to interview these various alibi witnesses. The investigator did as he was hired to do. But then Carl's attorney did not check on his findings for several months. By the time he did, according to the Fall River docuseries, the investigator had died. So the defense had to quickly hire someone else to do these interviews, but at that point, it was nearly time for the trial, and almost a year had passed since Karen's murder. Their memories were pretty good a couple of months after the murder, but they were fuzzy at best a year later. So the jury got this alibi from two sources. They got it from Carl when he testified, and from a woman who worked for him and had also admitted to the police that she was afraid of him. So not really the most reliable sources. The defense then had another blow when one of their other witnesses refused to testify at the last minute. Sunny had told Carl that she would testify on his behalf that it was Robin, the star prosecution witness, who had confessed to having killed Karen herself, and that Robin had said something about how the police would never find the body. But most importantly, she would say that Robin did not implicate Carl Drew until she was in talks about cutting a deal with the police. But when Sunny came in to testify, she immediately took the fifth, which seemed very strange, given that in no version of these stories was she implicated in Karen's murder. Sunny said she wanted to tell the truth, but she was afraid to, so the judge ordered her down from the stand. She apparently caused a bit of a ruckus, continuing to insist she wanted to tell the truth, and she was then removed from the courtroom. It doesn't look like Carl's attorney did much follow-up to find out, one, why Sunny thought she would need to take the fifth, or two, what she was so afraid of. It would take years to find this out, and we'll get into that in part 2. We need to stick with our timeline. Before the jury went to deliberate, the judge gave the usual instructions and also warned them that this was not a case about Satanism, this was not a case about religious beliefs, and they had to set all of that aside and focus on, did the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Carl Drew committed this murder? The jury spent less than 4 hours deliberating before they decided that yes, the state met their burden and they convicted Carl Drew of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. So then it was time to move forward to the next trials. Remember, Carl Drew was still facing additional charges in Doreen's case, and so was Willie Smith. And then we have Carl Davis, who was awaiting trial for his role in Karen's murder. Carl Drew said he barely knew Doreen and he would never have wanted her to work for him because she was underage. So to him, there was no motive there. Plus, Carl said he had an alibi for that night. And this is not an alibi of I was hanging out at the bar with my friends. He was actually at a family member's wedding and they have photos of him there. I am not sure why this didn't come up at Karen's murder trial, since covering up Doreen's murder was the supposed motive to kill Karen. Or maybe it did come up and I just missed it. I don't always find everything out there, so that's always a possibility. Willie Smith was also denying involvement and said he barely knew Carl Drew and he certainly wasn't hanging out with him that night or any other night. And Carl Davis said that he and Carl Drew also didn't hang out together. They knew each other in passing and he knew Carl Drew's reputation of being an awful person, but the idea that they were in some kind of conspiracy to kill Karen together was just absurd. As for what they would have presented specifically in court for their defenses, we just don't know. The charges ended up being dropped for all three of them. With Carl Drew, according to the state, it didn't really matter if they tried and convicted him or not, because he was already serving life without parole. And with the others, the DA said that a key witness was no longer available, and another key witness was no longer cooperating. The unavailable witness was Carol Fletcher, who had left the state again to try to get her life together, and they did not know exactly how to reach her. And Robin was the one who was not working with them any longer, which they learned about when her new attorney let them know that her testimony was not going to help them. She was supposedly a witness to 2 murders, yet she did not have testimony that would help. And that's because she was changing her story yet again, and this time she was recanting. Robin would later say that she actually tried to recant her statement that she saw Doreen's murder even before Carl Drew's trial. The information she had came from Karen, but Robin herself wasn't actually there. However, she believed Karen that he had killed Doreen, so to help make a case against him, she repeated what Karen had told her as though she was the one who witnessed it. Robin said she told the DA this before she testified in Carl Drew's trial. But she was told she had to testify to what they agreed to. It's how she got her immunity deal, and the threat here was that they could pull it if she didn't. And while these things are really hard to confirm, I actually found a little detail in a footnote to an appeal that Willie Smith had made regards to a pretrial motion. So for my true crime researchers out there, read the footnotes because you never know what you're going to find there. Basically, what happened was, in regards to Doreen's murder, the prosecutor had filed a nolle prosequi on Robin on the same day she pleaded guilty in the murder of Karen Marsden. In English, they were not prosecuting. But this was not a dismissal or an acquittal that would then trigger double jeopardy. They reserved the right to re-indict Robin if she didn't uphold the agreement to testify against the others. So at Carl Drew's trial for the murder of Karen Marsden, Robin testified that she saw Doreen's murder, though she claims she had already recanted. But then when it came time for the next round of trials, she just wouldn't do it. It was possible that her new attorney advised her that they were very unlikely to prosecute her because there was really no evidence against her in Doreen's murder other than her own testimony. Or maybe she just decided to tell the truth that she wasn't there and face the consequences. Or maybe she had some other motive. It's really hard to say with people like Robin Murphy, who had learned to be pragmatic over literally everything else and would tell so many lies to that end that there really is no telling what's the truth. In 1984, Carl Drew filed a motion for a new trial, and at a hearing for that, Robin officially recanted her previous testimony about being present for Doreen's murder. Carl's attorney argued that if she lied about that, she very well could have been lying about being there for Karen's murder. It was a solid argument, but not enough to get a new trial. So Andy Maltese, Carl Drew, and Robin Murphy all went to prison. Andy died in prison in 1988, and Robin, rather than getting paroled at the earliest possible date, ended up staying in prison for 24 years until 2004 when she was granted parole. And it's what she said to the parole board at that time that threw everything on its head in this case, because she recanted not just what she said about Doreen's murder, but what she said about Barbara's murder and Karen's as well. And then, when more people began recanting one by one, people started wondering if Carl Drew and or Andy Maltese were wrongfully convicted. And if they were, who really killed Doreen Levesque, Barbara Raposa, and Karen Marsden? And that's what we'll get into in part 2, which will be published as soon as I get it done.